My name is Starr Krottinger. I am a member of the 2010 class of Tarrant County Master Gardeners. I am past president of the North Central chapter of Native Plant Society. I love grasses, and I am the one who's responsible for this presentation. Tarrant Regional Water District provides support for programs, particularly in areas that encourage you to make good use of the water that we have. TRWD has 4 primary lakes that provide the water for the Tarrant Regional Water District, and it has massive pipelines that pipe that water from as far away as southwest of Corsicana. It also provides for anyone who lives in Tarrant County a free sprinkler check where the specialist will come out and tell you whether your sprinkler is working at its optimum or not. You can also sign up for free weekly watering advice, all from SaveTarrantWater.com. From this website, you can also check their calendar of events for classes and programs and get water-saving tips and videos. This particular slide is not my yard, although I kind of wish it were because it's such a beautiful yard, but it belonged to a friend of mine who has since moved away, and who knows what the new owner has done to this gorgeous landscape. So what you're probably saying is that's not all grasses. Well, no, it isn't, because like any well-designed garden area, it's not going to be all one thing. I will point out a couple of particular grasses. Here and back here, and even clear way back here, is what is Lindheimer's muley, sometimes called big muley, but it is a good grass to use, and it's very good in our area. It also happens to be a native grass. We also have right here next to this, to the Lindheimer's muley, there is some Gulf muley that is just starting to bloom there. And then down over here in the shade where it's hard to see is another native grass, which is called seep muley. And we will be talking more about those grasses later. Always need to have common terminology so that when I say a word, you'll understand where I'm coming from. There are lots of words, and these do not just apply to grasses, they apply to plants in general. Particularly what we will look at today or include will be rhizome, which is a horizontal underground system, stem or root. We will also talk about inflorescent, which is any stem that has flowers growing up all around it, as opposed to like a rose where you have or a daisy where you have a bloom at the end of a stem. Grasses are monocots, which means they start out with a single leaf that comes up through the ground. The other thing is the difference between a fibrous root system and a taproot. Most of your grasses, and I would say all of the grasses that I'm aware of, but since I'm not aware of all of the grasses, have fibrous root systems, which is really good because that means you can divide that plant and share it with your friends and neighbors. A taproot is more like a dandelion that has one main root going down, and that would make it more difficult to share. So what exactly is a grass? A grass is anything that belongs in the member of Poaceae. It used to be called Gramineae, but they've changed the name to Poaceae. There are at least 600 genera and 10,000 species. It's one of the larger families in the plant kingdom. Some plants that you might not think about that are part of this family are corn, wheat, oats. All of those food plants that we use so heavily in our diets are grasses. We talked about monocots, but another important thing about grasses is that they're pollinated by wind, which means in general, it's not going to have a flashy bloom. It's not going to have a lovely scent to it because it doesn't need to attract birds or bees or other pollinators. All it has to have is a good wind to blow things around and spread its pollen to other plants. There are some things that may look like grasses but aren't. And this is just the 4 most common plants that resemble grasses that you might see. You won't be seeing this restios right here because that's almost entirely in the southern hemisphere. You do see cattails, rushes, and sedges. So why do you want to use grasses in your landscape? There are quite a few reasons. I will tell you that this particular grass is a canyon muley, which is an unusual grass in that it is a natural hybrid of a Gulf muley and a Lindheimer's muley. It occurs in nature, but since it is a hybrid, it isn't something that you can get commercially in any amount. It's pretty though. So one of the reasons that you might want to use grasses is form, texture, and shape. You can see in this slide you have 3 different grasses. All are grasses, but they do not look at all alike. On my far left is a close-up of a Lindheimer's muley, which has some uprightness to it, but it also has down here where it kind of flops over and gives some weeping effect. In the middle, we have a close-up of Mexican feathergrass, and the leaves on it are very, very fine, which makes it very responsive to any kind of a wind movement. On the far right, on my far right, is Indian grass, which is tall and kind of stocky, more similar to what you would expect to find in a cornfield than in a grass area, perhaps. The stems are stiffer and the grass doesn't grow like these other grasses, but it's still a grass. The luminous qualities of grasses is something that you cannot get from any other plant. And 2 of the grasses that are most beautiful when the sun is shining behind it are the Gulf muley, which has kind of an ethereal pink cloud sitting on top of the grasses. And even the Mexican feathergrass, when it's in bloom, has it turns the bloom on it is very hard to see, but the ends of your grasses get kind of white. And because it's such a small grass, the sun coming up or going down comes through that and makes it kind of glow. Quality of line is another reason why you might want to add grasses to your landscape. You can see these are 2 grasses. One has a very upright and linear sense to it, and the other has more of the fountainy, flowing look to it. So it depends on what you want and where you need to put it as to what kind of grass you might want to use. Another thing about grasses is that there are at least a million zillion shades of green, and you can find many of those in our grasses. The grass on the left here is again the little blue stem, which has a very definite blue-gray tint to it that is easy to see. In the fall, it turns a beautiful russet color. On the right is purple fountain grass, obviously named for the purple hue of not only the leaves, but of the bloom that comes from it. And just so you know, this down here below it is Blackfoot daisy, which is an awesome plant to mix in with your grasses because it stays a low-growing plant and works beautifully with grasses. Movement and sound. There's nothing like an ocean wave crashing against the shore to exemplify the movement and sound. The movement you get in grasses is when the wind blows, and the wind makes the grasses weave, just like in the song Waves of Grain this grain being a grass, these are waves of grasses. And then many grasses actually, particularly when they have their bloom or their seed pods, also have a sound to them as it matures and grows. Whenever you plant anything, you need to consider several things, and grasses are no different. You have to, first of all, ask yourself, is it appropriate to our climate? How much water is it going to need to survive? How big will it get? Does it want to be in the sun or the shade? What type of soil? How much room, etc., etc. Grasses are the same. You have to consider these things when you put it in the ground, because what you put in the ground is going to grow and be bigger than what you might think. One of the all-time arguments when it comes to grasses and plants in general are, is it better to use adaptive or is it better to stay native? There really isn't a right answer to that. The good news about using adaptive plants is that it increases the selection that you might have. The bad news is if there are some adaptive plants, grasses and others, that can become quite invasive and take over areas where you don't want them to be. The good news about natives is because they are native, they're generally easier to grow and more resistant to the climate extremes and the insects and whatever else there might be in our area. And the even better news about using native grasses is that Texas has a long list of beautiful native grasses. Tarrant Regional Water District has available cards, which are called plant cards, the top 100 plants for North Texas. And the first part of my presentation is going to come from what North Tarrant Regional Water District recommends for you to grow as a grass. It will include both adaptive and native grasses and even a sedge. This is the front and back of the card. And one of the things about any plant that's important is to look at the scientific name, because that tells you about the plant, and it also can tell you whether or not something is in that plant genera. These cards also give you the height and spread and what it attracts, as well as water usage. The first grass they have on here is called Moudry or Maudry. I'm not sure exactly what the correct pronunciation of it is. And if I went to the plant area, I have not found that locally, but I have found other pennisetum grasses that share the same characteristics. Some are among my favorite. This is an adaptive grass. It is not generally native to our area. This is a picture of the flowering spike on it, just there to show you that in general, and I hardly ever use ever or always because, you know, there's too many genera and too many possibilities for me to be wrong to say always or never. But the pennisetum grasses have a flowering bloom that is very similar to this in most cases. The dwarf Hamlin grass is another. Again, you see in the picture here the fuzzy defined bloom that it has. This is also called a little bunny grass, very similar to that, but it stays small and is a good use if you have an area that where you can't put a big grass, you just need a little something to fill in a corner or something like that. This is purple fountain grass, also in the pennisetum family, and one of my very favorite non-native grasses. And these grasses originated in Asia, China area, where a lot of our adaptive plants come from. You can see this was actually taken in downtown Fort Worth at the Worthington Hotel, if it's still called that. And they used it in a flower bed there, and you can see the purple and white flowers at the, I think these are pentas, but I wouldn't guarantee that because it's not a grass, so I don't know. Here is another picture of purple fountain grass with the Blackfoot daisies down around the bottom. Now, in general, people will tell you with validity that if you are growing purple fountain grass here in our area, you need to treat it as an annual, whereas most of your grasses are perennial. Because of our cooler winters than its native area, it does not always live through the winter. This is at our demonstration garden, not too far from where we are right here, but just out of curiosity, I decided I was going to see if I could make this grass live through the winter. So after I cut it back, I mulched it really good, and lo and behold, I had the grasses come back the next year. But if you notice anything, there's a pretty significant difference between that and that. It has lost a lot of its color. And then here's one where kind of a side by side with a grass that had been planted new that year that shows a lot more color to it than the grass that had been carried over through the winter. I cannot tell you that this always happens. I can tell you that it happened in this circumstance. You will have to decide whether or not it is worth your time and effort to maintain this grass or to buy another one next spring. And that's another thing. You often see these grasses available in nurseries in the fall because that's when they're the showiest. But particularly if you are thinking in terms of growing this grass as an annual, then buy it in the spring so that by the time it's fall, it will grow to this size and you can enjoy it like it needs to be enjoyed. If you buy it in October, you have maybe a month, 2 months for it to grow before you have our freezes in November. Another grass on the TRWD recommendations is maiden grass. And this is the scientific name, Miscanthus sinensis. And this Miscanthus sinensis comes out in all different forms. This particular one is shown to be 3 to 6 feet tall, and it spreads and it lasts, and it's really a very pretty grass. It has a problem though, particularly in the southeastern United States, where it has been put on the National Forestry's invasive lists. I have not seen it be too much of a problem here, but it could be if we have a particularly conducive to it, because each one of these little blooms up here has many, many, many seeds in it. Adagio is the dwarf form of the same grass. It just doesn't grow to be quite as tall. And one of the things that you can see and kind of use to tell you yourself when you're shopping for grasses, the Miscanthus has this dominant white rib in it. And if you look at the full-size Miscanthus, or if you look at the Adagio, or if you look even at the zebra grass, it will have that, although in the zebra grass it's a little fainter, but you will still have that white central rib. And you look at the name, it's the exact same name as all those other, as the Miscanthus grass, except it is a cultivar called Zebrinus, and it's called zebra grass. Actually, if you look on this picture quite closely, you can see a little bit of the white rib right there. Here's another showing of the white rib. So it's a kind of a flashy grass, but it is the same exact plant, just with a different color variety, just bred to have that interesting color. Again, it's used a lot, it's readily available, but be careful with this grass, it can become invasive. Mexican feathergrass is an interesting little grass. It is a perennial like most grasses. It needs sunshine like most grasses. It doesn't live as long as most grasses, but that doesn't need to be a problem because, as it says right here, the grass easily reseeds. Now that can be good news or bad news, depending on where it chooses to reseed. But if it grows in a place where you don't want it, it's very easy to get rid of. And if you have it planted in an area where you don't care if it's 3 inches moved one way or the other, then you'll have a continual stand of native grasses, Mexican feathergrass, for as long as you want it to be there. It stays short. It's also called a cool weather grass because it sets these little feathery blossoms early in the year, June for sure, whereas most of your grasses have their blooms, their inflorescence in the fall. One of the interesting things about Mexican feathergrass is the seed. If you look at this mass, those are all seeds and their the mechanism by which it is spread. If you look right up here, see that little bitty dot right there? That's the seed. All of this, the rest of this hair-like thing is designed to help it spread. And this picture, which I tend to pop ahead here sometimes, is a picture of my little black dog who was chasing something behind a stand of Mexican feathergrass. And you can see how effective its spreading mechanism is because he's got all kinds of Mexican feathergrass seeds on her back. I've mentioned before that most grasses like sun. This particular grass, inland sea oats, or as my friend calls them, endless sea oats, is a shade grass. This one looks more bamboo-y, which, as we talked about earlier, is in the grass family, but it does well in the shade. The little seed things like you see right here, there's each one of these little sections here is actually a seed. This whole thing is not a seed. It's a little package of a lot of different seeds. This is a picture that was taken outside Arlington City Hall several years ago, and I'm sure they've changed things by now, but it just shows how they have used inland sea oats around a giant tree planter in their courtyard. Inland sea oats do spread quite easily, which again can be good news and bad news. I have it planted on the north side of my house, and every now and then it shows up on the south side, and I don't know how that happens, but it does. So if you have it growing somewhere you don't want it, it's easy enough to just pull out and or share with a friend. In the fall, those seed pods turn into a bright golden brown color, and it really is quite dramatic because the grass stays green much longer, and you have this green and brown area in your landscape. There are quite a few Muhlenbergia grasses, particularly in Texas. This is a native Texas grass, and it is probably one of the most dramatic, the most used in landscapes, and it is a beautiful grass. People often ask me how I got interested in grasses, and it is very simply that I was in Midland, Texas, and saw actually a Master Gardener demo garden where they had multiple dry weather plants, and they had Gulf Muley out there, and it happened to be at the time when it was blooming, and this purple cloud over these grasses is just beautiful. And when you get up close to it, it's just tiny little blooms that are nothing by themselves, but when you mass them together, they become gorgeous. This picture was taken at our particular grass garden demonstration area, and it shows the heavy dew that actually froze into little ice crystals on the ends of the plants, which I thought was pretty, so I took a picture. This picture really just kind of shows you the luminescence of the Gulf Muley as the sun shines behind it. So this plant I may or may not have mentioned is commonly called Gulf Muley, which common names often tell you something more than just the scientific name. But the Gulf Muley is called Gulf Muley because that's where it is most prominently found and where it's most comfortable, which should also tell you that it may need a little bit more water than some of our other grasses do. I have in the past volunteered at the Southwest Sub Courthouse, and this area of a yard is, we often call this the hell strip, because it's a narrow area, which often is a very hot area, and it can also be a very dry area. But the rest on this side of the sidewalk, there is a slope that goes upward, so that this area right here is actually, this little arrow guy hides from me sometimes. This little area right here is down below the slope. When we planted these grasses, the first thing we did was dug that whole area out till it was about 4 inches below the level of the sidewalk. Then we filled it back in with mulch, and then we planted our plants. Now, this picture shows you the good news, bad news. The good news is our Gulf muleys did beautifully. The bad news is we maybe didn't plan exactly right. If you look back here, plants were small, plenty of room for them to grow. But as they grew and expanded, they encroached on the sidewalk and made it difficult for anyone to walk by. So once again, when you're putting a plant or planting a garden, you need to think in terms of what area that grass or other plant is going to take when it reaches its maturity. White cloud muley, if you look at the name, it's the exact same plant that we were just talking about, but it has been bred to have white blooms instead of the pink blooms. My personal opinion on that is why, but that's why we have different plants for different people. This is another native grass. I am not even going to begin to try and tell you what that plant name is, but the common name is little blue stem for various reasons, and one of which is the blue hue to its stems and leaves. It's not called little blue stem because it stays small. It's called little blue stem in relationship to big blue stem, which is a much coarser grass than this. And the two plants are not even in the same genera, but they both have the blue hue to the gray blue hue to their stems. Many, many years ago, when people first started coming into the prairies, you heard stories of the tall, tall grasses and how they were so tall, a man sitting on his horse would have to be on his horse to see where he was going. Well, not all of the grasses were that tall, but there are 4 that we generally refer to as the big 4 prairie grasses, and little blue stem is one of those. The other 3, and I hope I can remember these right off, but we have little blue stem, big blue stem, switchgrass, and Indian grass. Of those 4, 3 of them are used sometimes ornamentally. The little blue stem and the Indian grass are both recommended by TRWD as plants that you might want to include in your landscape. This grass is particularly pretty in the fall as it turns to that russet color. And one of the things that I have seen done, and if both plants cooperated, it can be quite stunning, and that is to plant fall aster around next to it. And fall aster has a beautiful lavender purple bloom to it, and next to the russet of the little blue stem, it makes a really dramatic show. Unfortunately, plants don't always cooperate, and to get that purple and rust color at the same time, it does not always happen. Mentioned Indian grass. It's another of the big 4. It can grow quite tall, and its seed head at the top is usually yellow. It can also be russet or brown tones. It actually looks more russet in this picture, but it can grow very tall. And if you are going to use this in your landscape, because it grows it has rhizomes, and we mentioned that earlier. Those are underground stems that grow laterally from the center core of the plant. And if you don't want to have your Indian grass growing wider and farther, then an easy thing to do is when you plant it in a 5-gallon pot, you know, like you get from the nurseries. Take the bottom out of it so it doesn't collect water, but it will keep the Indian grass from spreading further than you want it to grow. Just other pictures. This picture shows the bloom is more of a yellow hint, and this just kind of shows you how tall it is. That is, however, I will have to admit, that is not a full-size windmill that you're seeing the base of. This is the last of the TRWD recommendations. It's called Berkeley sedge, and I cannot speak about that intelligently at all because I have not ever grown it, but I include it because it is part of the TRWD recommendations. There are some grasses that I really like that were not included in TRWD, and since this is my program, I added them. One of those is a pretty little grass called hooded windmill grass. This gets to be, it's a short grass, but what's really interesting about it is this seed head that grows kind of like a windmill gone crazy, with all of these seeds growing on these stems. It stays short, and it is a perennial. This picture is not just a mass of stuff. This shows you a hooded windmill grass here that still has its little seeds attached to the stem, to the plant, to the veins, whereas these in the back have lost all of their seeds. So it really looks very different. This is seep muley. This is another one of those beautiful muleys, but unfortunately it's not available very much in our nurseries or big box stores, wherever you might buy plants. But it's like the Gulf muley in that it has similar seed head, but it doesn't get as big. This only is going to get maybe 2 feet tall, whereas the Gulf muley can be much taller than that. This particular grass has a white bloom, although I understand that it can have a pinkish bloom. I've never seen that, but I've read that, so I have to, of course, believe it. But anyway, it's a good plant to have in your ornamental in your garden. Seep muley, often found in seeps, areas where water will sometimes collect and remain there for a little bit, and other times be dry. So that tells you again a little bit about how to care for this plant. If it gets too much water, don't worry about it, because once that water goes away and dries out, it'll be fine. This is a close-up of the seep muley that I have in my yard, and you can see that that just teeny tiny little blooms and masses of them. Side oats grama is an interesting plant. It is the state grass of Texas. It isn't at all showy, but it's just such an interesting grass. I really think it should be included in landscapes more often. This shows you the plant when it's in bloom in the spring. And while it's difficult to see, there are on the side here beautiful red, deep red, scarlet-shaped blooms. Now, unfortunately, they don't always come out and bloom at the same time, and it's such a tiny little bloom that it's difficult to see it. It's kind of like one of those things where you walk by and you see it out of the corner of your eye, and you have to go back and look at it more closely. But side oats grama is called that for the very reason that all of the blooms or the seeds are on one side of that central stem. So it's called side oats grama because they're all on one side. As I said, it's the native grass of Texas, and it's not showy, but I just think it's pretty and should be included. Lindheimer muley is, sometimes people ask me, well, Starr, what's your favorite grass? And I say, well, I really like this, and I really like this, and I really like this, which tells you it's hard for me to choose. But in that list would be Lindheimer's muley. It really likes my yard, and I have a lot more of it than I did when I started, because I've been able to, it has seeded, and I've been able to move it to different places. And I don't think I'll ever run out of another place to stick it, but it is an absolutely gorgeous grass in the fall. It's pretty even before its blooms come out and turn to seed, but when it's at full bloom, it is absolutely gorgeous and very different from most of your other grasses. I was looking at this slide earlier, and I said, it's almost like being in a drone and looking down on a pine forest. But it's just so pretty to me. It's almost always this kind of a silver color, and it takes a while to get to that point. If you looked at it right now, it would look, these little seed pods are still closed up and not opened up yet. And but once they open up, they're really spectacular. And that's the only picture I have of that, which is surprising but it's really pretty. Grows to be pretty good size, so you need to be careful on that. And I have to tell you, I kind of skip over these slides where it has all of the specific information on there, but they are going to be here and available to you, and you can always go back and highlight those slides. So care and maintenance of your grasses, pretty similar to any other plant. You have to make sure it has the appropriate amount of water and sunlight. Almost always you're going to have grasses in the sun. Where did grasses come from? They came from the prairies. What did you have in the prairies? Lots of sun and not very many trees. So sunlight is almost always going to be a requirement. And then some grasses need more water than others, but as a rule, they're pretty low maintenance. Soils, I have heavy clay, black clay at my house, and they do really well. Some do better in rocky soils, but it's just like anything else. You have to look at your plant and decide whether or not it's going to work for your garden in your area. As far as maintenance is concerned, there's not much to do except in late winter or early spring. You probably want to do one of these three things, all of which are being done for the very same reason. Grasses grow from the inside out. You start out with a stem or two, and as time goes on, it grows outward. And so the oldest part of your plant is in the center, and that is probably going to be the area that dies first. So what you're going to do is you're going to trim back your grasses to a couple of inches above the ground. You often will see grasses all nicely mounded, which is done so that they look prettier. Grasses don't care. You can cut them straight off. You can cut them off. Actually, probably the lower the better. But if you want it to be pretty all winter long and you want that nice little rounded grass clump, then round it and clump it. But it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. Instead of trimming it back, and by the way, when I trim mine back, I use a hedge clipper, electric hedge clipper, which is just so much easier than anything else. If you don't want to do that, you can rake out the dead grass from the center, so that, and this is what happens to a grass as it ages, or if you haven't done proper to it. See how it's dying from the inside out? But if you trim it back so that this center area continues to get light and moisture, then your grasses are going to last longer. And that's why we're doing this. We're either going to cut it back, we're going to rake out the dead leaves, or if you want to pretend you still live on the prairie, you can do a controlled burn. Now, if you live in Fort Worth or Arlington or any kind of community, they're not going to like that. And it's probably not a good thing to do anyway, because it's this controlled word that could be the problem. But if you think about, once again, think about where grasses came from. They came from the prairie. And way back then, they didn't have, they were not cut down except by the buffalo. But every now and then there'd be a prairie fire, and that would control, and that would burn the grasses, and they would come back up, so that you don't end up with a grass that looks like this. But the good news, bad news about this grass is this center part is no good. It's not a viable grass at this point. But look at all of this grass around here on the edges. Remember I told you early on that grasses have fibrous roots? So you may not want to keep this grass here, but you can cut that grass into 10 different sections at least, and make sure you get some root so that you can replant that grass, transplant it, and you'll have more grasses. Normally, when you're going to do something like that, you're going to want to trim the grass back so that the roots will have a lot of energy going to it rather than maintaining the grasses. So if you're going to propagate a grass, you can collect the seeds after the bloom fades, but good luck with that, because most cases they're very, very small, and they can take a while to germinate. Many of them naturally propagate by using rhizomes, which go out and then come up and start a new grass. But the most practical way for us to propagate grasses is to use division, which is when you separate a clump of grasses into multiple clumps. Make sure you get enough root, because if you don't get enough root, you have a really pretty clump of grass that dies a couple of weeks later. These are some of the sources that have helped me in my quest for learning more about grasses, and particularly using them in your landscape. And these are all available just about anywhere you want to find them. And then lastly, if you want to make a road trip, the grass demonstration garden here at Tarrant Resource Connection is a great way to see the size and shape and color of grasses, many of which we've talked about here. And then the Southwest Sub Courthouse has some pretty grasses growing there also. Websites. The plants.usda.gov is a great research tool. If you want to know a little bit about a plant, then you can search that either by a scientific or common name. One of my favorite websites is the Lady Johnson Wildflower site, www.wildflower.org. Shows you pictures and descriptions and recommendations on a lot of particularly native plants. And then, of course, when you have a question or need help, your first source should always be agriculture.tmau.edu. So that brings us back to this beautiful garden and how my friend Pat incorporated grasses in specific places to liven up and provide a diversity in her landscape. Now, I expect you all to start out working on your yard so that it can look just like this. Again, my name is Starr Krottinger, and I thank you so much for spending time with me.